Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling cases of institutional silence in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned 3 decades, buried deep in the archives of a crumbling asylum in rural Massachusetts, where a woman known only as patient number 447 defied all medical explanation and left a legacy so disturbing that her file was sealed for 70 years after her death. It was the year 1928. The world was dancing to jazz, investing wildly in a stock market that would soon collapse, and women had just won the right to vote. In the shadow of the Berkshire Mountains, however, the situation was drastically different. There, the Blackwood State Hospital for the Insane stood like a Gothic monument to suffering, its brick walls stained black from decades of coal smoke, its windows reflecting nothing but darkness, even in the brightest daylight. The facility housed over 2,000 souls, most of them forgotten by families who could no longer afford to care for them, or who simply found their conditions too shameful to acknowledge. On a morning in late September, as autumn leaves began their slow descent toward Earth, a woman was admitted through the hospital's imposing iron gates. She arrived without a name. The intake form, which would later become evidence in one of the strangest investigations in psychiatric history, listed her simply as Jane Doe, patient number 447. Her age was estimated at 35, though her eyes suggested someone who had lived far longer. She wore a simple gray dress that had once been expensive, now torn and muddy. Her hands bore no calluses. These were not the hands of a laborer. Her speech, when she chose to speak, revealed education and refinement. But it was what she knew that made her dangerous. To understand this story, you must first understand Blackwood. The asylum sat on 300 acres of isolated land, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to press against the building itself, as if nature were trying to reclaim what humans had built. The main structure was a massive Victorian edifice constructed in 1883, designed according to the Kirkbride plan, a revolutionary architectural approach that promised to heal mentally ill through exposure to light, air, and beautiful surroundings. But by 1928, Blackwood had become something else entirely. Overcrowding had transformed the healing corridors into warehouses for the unwanted. Rooms designed for 2 patients now housed 6 or 7. The beautiful grounds had grown wild and unkempt, the gardens choked with weeds, the fountains dry and cracked. The hospital that had once represented progressive treatment had devolved into a place where people were sent to be forgotten. The staff, overworked and underpaid, cycled through the facility with disturbing frequency. Attendance often lasted only weeks before the screaming, the violence, and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness drove them away. The doctors fared little better. Most were recent graduates, desperate for any position, or older physicians whose careers had faltered elsewhere. Except for Dr. Nathaniel Ashworth. Dr. Ashworth had been at Blackwood for 23 years. He had arrived as a young, idealistic physician, convinced he could make a difference. Now, at 52, his hair had gone completely white, and his face bore the deep lines of someone who had witnessed too much suffering. But unlike his colleagues, he had not grown callous. Instead, he had developed an almost obsessive dedication to his patients, particularly those whom others had deemed hopeless. When patient 447 arrived, it was Dr. Ashworth who conducted her initial evaluation. The intake room was small and windowless, lit by a single bulb that cast harsh shadows across the peeling paint. Dr. Ashworth sat across a scarred wooden table from the woman, his notebook open, his pen poised to record the standard questions. "Can you tell me your name? he asked, his voice gentle. The woman stared at him with eyes the color of storm clouds. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Names are dangerous here," she said. Her voice was cultured, with the faint remnant of a Boston accent. "You should know that, Doctor. Doctor." Ashworth felt something cold move down his spine. "Why were you brought here?" "Because I remember." "Remember what?" "Everything." Patient 447 was assigned to Ward C, the women's chronic ward on the second floor of the East Wing. It was one of the older sections of the hospital, where the plaster had cracked to reveal the brick underneath, and where the radiators clanked and hissed through cold nights, but provided little actual heat. Her bed was number 17, positioned near a window that looked out over the forest. The other women in the ward, 40, 3 of them in a space designed for 20, paid little attention to the new arrival. Most were lost in their own internal worlds, muttering to themselves, rocking endlessly, or staring at nothing with empty eyes. But within a week, something began to change. The night nurse, a woman named Margaret Cole, who had worked at Blackwood for 15 years, was the first to notice. During her rounds on the third night of patient 447's stay, she found 7 women gathered around the new patient's bed. They weren't speaking. They were simply sitting, watching the woman with an intensity that Margaret found deeply unsettling. "Ladies, back to your beds," Margaret said, her voice firm but not unkind. The women didn't move. Patient 447, sitting up in bed with her back against the cold plaster wall, met Margaret's eyes. "They're remembering, too," she said quietly, "the things they were told to forget." Margaret felt the hair on her arms rise. "That's enough. Everyone back to bed, now." This time the women obeyed, shuffling back to their assigned places with reluctant, backward glances. But Margaret knew something had shifted. After 20 years working in asylums, she had developed an instinct for danger. And every instinct she possessed was now screaming. She reported the incident to Dr. Ashworth the next morning. What did she mean, things they were told to forget? He asked, his pen scratching across his notes. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know, Doctor, but there was something about the way she said it, like she was talking about something specific, something real. Doctor." Ashworth scheduled an evaluation for later that day. When he entered Ward C that afternoon, he found patient 447 sitting by her window, staring out at the trees. The autumn light caught her face, and for a moment she looked almost ethereal. A woman displaced from time, trapped in the wrong century. "Will you speak with me, Doctor?" Ashworth asked. She turned from the window. "Yes, but not here. They listen." "Who listens?" "The ones who put me here, Doctor." Ashworth arranged for a private consultation room, a rare luxury at overcrowded Blackwood. The room was small but clean, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that actually opened. He had ordered fresh flowers placed on the desk, a touch of humanity in the institutional bleakness. Patient 447 entered the room escorted by an attendant, but Dr. Ashworth dismissed the guard. The woman sat down slowly, her movements careful, controlled. "Tell me about yourself, Doctor," Ashworth said. "Whatever you're willing to share." For a long moment she was silent. Then she began to speak, her voice low but steady. "I was a secretary in Boston. I worked for a law firm, Morrison, Whitfield, and Crane. Do you know it, Doctor?" Ashworth nodded slowly. It was one of the most prestigious firms in Massachusetts, representing old money families and powerful political interests. "I was good at my work, very good. I learned stenography, kept perfect records, managed confidential files. Mr. Crane trusted me. He would dictate his most sensitive correspondence with me present. Knowing I was discreet," She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden armrest. In the summer of 1927, I transcribed a series of letters regarding a property transfer. It seemed routine, wealthy families buying and selling land, but I noticed something. Same properties were being sold repeatedly, each time at inflated prices. Paper companies creating debt, transferring assets to avoid taxation, defrauding investors. Her eyes met his, and Dr. Ashworth saw something there that chilled him absolute clarity. I mentioned it to Mr. Crane. I thought perhaps there had been an error. He smiled at me, told me I was very observant. Then he asked me to forget what I'd seen. And did you? I tried, but then I saw names, senators, judges, the governor's chief of staff, money changing hands, bribes documented in careful legal language that made them look legitimate. I realized I wasn't just witnessing fraud. I was witnessing corruption at the highest levels. The room had grown very quiet. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the forest. "What did you do?" Dr. Ashworth asked. "I made copies. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I knew documentation mattered. I hid them in my apartment, and then—" She smiled that cold smile again. "Then I made the mistake of telling someone I trusted." Dr. Ashworth spent the next 3 weeks investigating patient 447's claims. He wrote letters to Morrison, Whitfield, and Crane, inquiring about former employees. The firm's response was swift and curt. They had no record of any Jane Doe matching the description, and they would appreciate no further correspondence. He searched through Boston city directories, trying to find women who had disappeared in late 1927. There were dozens of women who had simply vanished from their lives, leaving no trace. Some had surely moved away, remarried, died of natural causes. But others had ended up in places like Blackwood. The more Dr. Ashworth investigated, the more disturbed he became. He discovered that Blackwood received funding from a private trust established by several wealthy Boston families whose names appeared in his patient's story. The hospital's board of directors included 2 judges and a retired senator. He began to review admission records, looking for patterns. What he found made his blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, 17 women had been admitted to Blackwood under suspicious circumstances. Most arrived without proper identification, committed by doctors whose credentials were difficult to verify. Several had been transferred from private sanitariums, their medical records conveniently lost in transit. And almost all of them, according to the sparse notes in their files, had been diagnosed with the same condition: delusional disorder with persecutory ideation. They believed people were trying to silence them. Dr. Ashworth requested permission to interview these women. His request was denied by the hospital administrator, Dr. Leonard Whitcomb, a man whose position Dr. Ashworth now realized had been secured through a generous donation from one of Boston's most influential families. But Dr. Ashworth was not easily deterred. He began conducting informal consultations during his regular rounds, speaking with the women who had been flagged in the records. Most were too medicated or too damaged by years of institutional life to provide coherent accounts. But 3 of them, when approached carefully and given time, began to share their stories. One had been a nurse who had witnessed a doctor performing illegal abortions on wealthy women. Another had been a maid in a prestigious household who had overheard conversations about vote, buying, and election fraud. The third had been a teacher who had discovered that a prominent school headmaster was embezzling funds meant for orphans. All of them had tried to report what they knew. All of them had ended up at Blackwood, and all of them had been committed by the same private physician, Dr. Edmund Fairchild, whose practice catered exclusively to Boston's elite. Dr. Ashworth knew he was uncovering something dangerous. He began documenting everything, keeping duplicate records hidden in his home, a modest cottage on the hospital grounds. He wrote letters to colleagues at other institutions, asking careful questions about similar cases. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. There was a network, a quiet system by which inconvenient people, primarily women who had witnessed crimes or corruption, were being silenced not through violence but through institutionalization. Diagnosed as delusional, declared incompetent, locked away where their testimonies would be forever discredited. Patient 447 had been right. They were listening, and they had noticed Dr. Ashworth's investigation. On a November evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Dr. Ashworth returned to his cottage to find his front door slightly ajar. He lived alone. His wife had died of influenza a decade earlier, and his daughter was married and living in California. He always locked his door. He pushed it open slowly. The interior had been searched. Not ransacked, nothing was broken or obviously disturbed, but everything had been moved slightly. Books pulled from shelves and replaced in the wrong order. Desk drawers opened and closed imprecisely. Papers rifled through with careful hands. His hidden records were gone. Dr. Ashworth stood in his violated home, snow melting on his shoulders, and felt fear settle into his bones like the November cold. He was being warned, cease the investigation or face consequences, but he had spent 23 years at Blackwood watching people be forgotten. He had held the hands of dying patients whose families never visited, had heard confessions that would never be recorded, had witnessed suffering that served no purpose except to warehouse. Inconvenient, he would not stop. The next morning, he requested a meeting with Dr. Whitcomb. The administrator's office was opulent compared to the rest of the hospital: oak, paneled walls, expensive furniture, a fire crackling in the hearth. Dr. Whitcomb sat behind his massive desk like a magistrate, his expression pleasant but his eyes cold. "Dr. Ashworth, I understand you've been conducting research into our admission practices. I've been reviewing patient files, yes, and making inquiries outside the hospital, writing to colleagues, asking questions about our benefactors." Dr. Ashworth met his gaze steadily. "I have concerns about the legitimacy of certain commitments." Dr. Whitcomb smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "Your concerns are noted. However, I must remind you that patient confidentiality is paramount. Discussing internal hospital matters with outside parties is a serious breach of professional ethics. And committing sane women to silence them is a crime." The words hung in the air between them. The fire crackled. Outside, crows called from the bare trees. "That's quite an accusation." Dr. Whitcomb said softly, "The kind of accusation that could destroy a career. The kind that suggests a man might be experiencing stress-related delusions himself." The threat was unmistakable. Dr. Ashworth left the office knowing his time was limited. That evening, he went to Ward C and asked to speak with patient 447 privately. In the consultation room, he told her everything he had discovered. "You were right," he said, "about all of it. There's a system. I don't know how high it goes, but it's real." She nodded slowly. "I know. I've heard things. The women here, the ones you talked to, they've been sharing their stories, piecing it together. There are more of us than you found." "Many more." "How many?" "Across different institutions. I can't be certain, but at Blackwood alone, at least 30, maybe 40. Dr. Ashworth felt sick. "I need evidence. Something concrete that can't be dismissed." Patient 447 was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There's a basement beneath the original building. from when this was a private estate before it became a hospital. Have you ever been down there? No, it's been sealed for years. Structural concerns. It's not sealed because of structural concerns. It's sealed because that's where they keep the records they don't want found. Dr. Ashworth knew accessing the basement was dangerous, but he also knew he was running out of time. That night, after the hospital had settled into its restless sleep, he made his way through the darkened corridors with a ring of keys he had borrowed from the maintenance office. The entrance to the basement was through a heavy wooden door near the kitchen, secured with a chain and padlock. The padlock was old, rusted, and it took 3 different keys before he found one that worked. The door opened with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the sleeping hospital. Beyond was darkness and a smell of damp earth and mildew. Dr. Ashworth lit the oil lamp he had brought and descended stone steps that were slick with moisture. The basement was extensive, a maze of rooms carved from bedrock when the building had been constructed. The original architect had been ambitious, creating storage areas, wine cellars, and servants' quarters underground. Most of it had been abandoned decades ago, but not all of it. In the third room he explored, Dr. Ashworth found filing cabinets, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows, each drawer labeled with years. He opened the nearest one. Inside were patient files, but not the official records kept in the hospital's main office. These were the real files, the ones that contained admission papers signed by Dr. Fairchild, correspondence between hospital administrators and the families who had paid for commitments, and in some cases, handwritten notes detailing exactly why each woman had been institutionalized. Overheard conversation regarding illegal land transactions. Potential witness. Discovered evidence of embezzlement. Has copies of financial documents. Servant in Brennan household. Witnessed domestic violence. Threatened to testify. Dr. Ashworth stood in that cold basement, holding his lamp high, reading file after file. Each one represented a life destroyed, a voice silenced, a truth buried. There were over 300 files in those cabinets. 300 women. Some of the dates went back to 1903, shortly after Blackwood had opened. This had been happening for 25 years. He found patient 447's real file. Her name was Catherine Mercer. She was 36 years old. She had been a senior secretary at Morrison, Whitfield, and Crane for 12 years. And according to a letter in her file from Mr. Crane himself to Dr. Whitcomb, she had indeed discovered evidence of massive fraud involving properties and political bribes. The letter was dated September 15, 1927. Catherine had been committed on September 23rd. She's too smart to simply disappear, Crane had written, but commitment will permanently destroy her credibility should she ever attempt to speak. Ensure she receives appropriate treatment to discourage any future difficulties. Dr. Ashworth understood what appropriate treatment meant: heavy sedation, isolation, perhaps more aggressive interventions like hydrotherapy or even lobotomy if she proved resistant. He took photographs. He had brought his camera, an expensive Kodak he usually used to document medical procedures. Now he photographed files, letters, admission papers, evidence that could not be denied. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs. When the voice spoke behind him, he jumped, nearly dropping his lamp. Working late, Dr. Ashworth. Dr. Whitcomb stood at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by 2 large attendants Dr. Ashworth recognized from the violent ward. Behind them was a man in an expensive suit, someone Dr. Ashworth didn't recognize, but whose presence radiated authority and threat. "This is private hospital property," Dr. Whitcomb said, his voice pleasant as always. "You're trespassing." Dr. Ashworth straightened. Holding his ground, "These files document criminal activity, illegal commitments, conspiracy." The man in the suit stepped forward. "My name is Andrew Morrison. My father founded the law firm where Miss Mercer was employed. That filing cabinet contains privileged legal materials. They contain evidence of crimes. They contain confidential medical records of mentally ill women who suffer from paranoid delusions. That's what any court will see. Morrison smiled. You've had a stressful career, Dr. Ashworth. 23 years working with the insane. It takes a toll. Perhaps you've begun to identify too closely with your patients. Started seeing conspiracies where there's only routine medical care. Dr. Ashworth felt the trap closing. You can't silence everyone. We don't need to silence everyone. Only the ones who won't stay quiet. Morrison gestured to the attendants. Dr. Ashworth is clearly experiencing a nervous breakdown. Please escort him to a secure room where he can rest and recover. The attendants moved forward. Dr. Ashworth backed against the filing cabinets, his mind racing. They were going to commit him, just like they had committed Catherine and all the others. And once he was a patient, his testimony would be worthless. But he still had his camera, and he still had one chance. He raised his voice, speaking loudly, clearly. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Ashworth. I am of sound mind. I am being illegally detained by representatives of a conspiracy to silence witnesses to political corruption. These men intend to commit me to this institution against my will, to prevent me from exposing their crimes. The attendants grabbed his arms. Dr. Ashworth continued speaking, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. If I am found in this institution as a patient, it will be because I was forcibly committed after discovering evidence of massive fraud and corruption. Catherine Mercer is sane. The women whose files are in these cabinets are sane. They were imprisoned for knowing the truth. One of the attendants hit him then, a hard blow to the stomach that drove the air from his lungs and silenced him. But Dr. Ashworth had not been alone in his investigation. Margaret Cole, the night nurse, had been watching the doctor's increasingly frantic research with growing concern. When he had borrowed the maintenance keys, she had followed him. And when she saw Dr. Whitcomb and the others descend into the basement, she had done something that would change everything. She had gone to the telephone in the nurses' station and called the police. Not the local police. She knew they were likely compromised, paid to look the other way when bodies needed to be buried or prisoners needed to be delivered to Blackwood. Instead, she called the Massachusetts State Police, asking specifically for a captain she had read about in the newspapers, a man known for his integrity and his refusal to be bought. Captain James Donnelly arrived at Blackwood at 2 in the morning with 8 state troopers. They found Dr. Ashworth locked in a padded cell in the violent ward, bruised but conscious. They found the basement files, and they found Catherine Mercer and 23 other women who were perfectly sane but had been held as psychiatric patients for months or years. The scandal that erupted destroyed careers and toppled powerful families. Andrew Morrison and his father were both convicted of conspiracy and fraud. Dr. Whitcomb died by suicide before his trial concluded. Dr. Fairchild fled to Europe and never returned. 3 judges were disbarred. 2 state senators resigned, but the victory was incomplete. The investigation revealed that while the conspiracy at Blackwood was extensive, it was not unique. Similar systems existed at private institutions across the country, quiet arrangements between wealthy families, corrupt physicians, and compliant asylum administrators. Women who knew too much, who threatened the wrong people, who refused to stay silent, were being institutionalized and forgotten. The practice was too widespread, too profitable, and too useful to the powerful to be completely eliminated by one scandal. Catherine Mercer was released from Blackwood on December 7, 1928. She was 36 years old. She had been imprisoned for 1 year, 2 months, and 14 days. The original documents she had hidden in her Boston apartment were never found. Her former employers had thoroughly searched her residence and destroyed any evidence she had gathered. Without the documentation, the fraud charges she had originally discovered could not be prosecuted. She spent the next 3 years trying to rebuild her life, but institutional commitment carried a permanent stigma. No law firm would hire her. No business would trust a former asylum patient with sensitive information. The very system that had imprisoned her continued to punish her through social ostracism and professional exclusion. In 1931, Catherine moved to a small town in Vermont. She changed her name, took work as a seamstress, and never spoke publicly about Blackwood again. Dr. Nathaniel Ashworth resigned from Blackwood shortly after the scandal broke. He testified in multiple trials, providing expert testimony about the condition of the wrongfully committed women. He spent his remaining years advocating for psychiatric reform and patient rights. He died in 1946 at the age of 70, still haunted by the 300 files he had found in that basement. 300 women. He had helped save 24 of them. The others had died in institutions, buried in unmarked graves, their stories forever lost. Margaret Cole continued working as a nurse. She never spoke publicly about the role she had played, but those who knew the truth never forgot. She received a commendation from the state police that she kept in a drawer and never displayed. She lived to be 92 years old. When she died in 1975, Catherine Mercer, now going by the name Helen Prescott, attended the funeral. It was the only time the two women met after that November night. Blackwood State Hospital continued operating until 1993, when it was finally closed due to changing mental health policies. The building stood empty for years, slowly decaying, before being demolished in 2008. The basement where the files had been hidden was filled with concrete before the demolition. No memorial marks the site. No plaque remembers the women who suffered there, but the records survived. In 1998, 70 years after Catherine's commitment, her file was unsealed as part of a historical archive project. Researchers discovered the full extent of the conspiracy, not just at Blackwood, but at institutions across the country. The practice of using psychiatric commitment to silence inconvenient witnesses continued well into the 1970s. It was never prosecuted as systematically as it should have been. The powerful protected their own, and the silenced remained voiceless even after death. The story of patient number 447, Catherine Mercer, remains a disturbing reminder that institutional power, when unchecked, will always find ways to silence dissent. That systems designed to help can be perverted into instruments of control. That the most effective prison is not one with bars, but one that destroys credibility. But questions remain. How many women like Catherine never escaped? How many died in institutions, their testimonies forever buried? How many witnesses to corruption, abuse, and crime were declared insane and locked away? The records suggest hundreds, perhaps thousands. And how many similar systems exist today, hidden beneath legitimate institutions, quietly removing people who threaten powerful interests? To this day, the forest where Blackwood once stood is considered haunted by local residents. People report voices on the wind, women's voices, calling out, trying to be heard. Psychologists explain this as auditory pareidolia, brain's tendency to find patterns in random sounds. But those who know the history wonder, on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the bare trees where Blackwood's wards once stood, if you listen carefully, you might hear something, not ghosts, perhaps, but memory, the echo of voices that refused to be silent, even when silence was enforced with locks and chains and the terrible weight of institutional authority. If this journey through institutional horror and the courage of those who fought against it resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering how easily truth can be buried and how vigilantly we must guard against the abuse of power, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined not for entertainment alone, but as warnings, as lessons, as reminders of the price of silence. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere fascination with past, and comment sharing your thoughts on how we prevent such systems from emerging again, on how we protect the vulnerable, on how we ensure that those who speak truth are not punished for their courage. Until next time, remember that history's darkest chapters are those it tries to erase. We remember, so they cannot be forgotten.